You're listening to the Grassroots Church podcast. We're a Jesus-centered community in Thunder Bay, Ontario. You can learn how to participate more by going to our website at grassroots.church.
To get started here this morning, I want to offer us a quick reminder about what we're doing in this series. Is we are providing fresh eyes, so to speak, on how we approach the book of Revelation, this book that sits at the end of our Bible that is full of cryptic imagery and all sorts of confusing symbolism and things like that. And we are seeing this not as a book of prophecy that is warning us of impending doom that's coming to earth. It's, that's not the lens we're looking at, but rather as a critique, and specifically a critique of empire. And for John, the author, the revelator, who's writing this, he was concerned specifically with the Roman Empire. But as we've seen throughout history, including today, this is a critique of empire in all of its expressions, be it Babylon, be it Rome, be it the British Empire, be it America today, be it really any system. Empire is a catch-all term that talks of sort of power structures, systems of power that oppress those who are within that system, who are victims of that system. And so those forms of power use a particular set of tactics to ensure that they maintain power and that they maintain security and they maintain sort of their positions of privilege. And those tactics are violence, right? Manipulation, propaganda, whatever coercive means they can use to sort of keep the people down and contain and maintain their sort of positions of power. And those who follow the Lamb, the slain Lamb of chapter 5 in Revelation, we are what we're calling dissenters to empire. We are within this empire, but we do not march by the same marching orders that dictate the rules of the empire. Right? We have our own marching orders in the face of evil. And we looked at those last week. The way that we overcome evil, the way that we overcome the ways of empire, as we said last week, are the blood of the Lamb, are testifying to the way of Jesus in our life and the way of Jesus in this world and how that looks day in and day out. And by not shrinking in the face of death, having no fear of death, having courage. And so the book of Revelation doesn't just find application in Rome, an empire that existed thousands of years ago, but it is intended to apply in our context. It is intended to encourage us, to instruct us. Revelation is written to show anyone who lives within the shadow of these oppressive regimes, whatever that regime might look like, how to conduct ourselves, how to live, and how to resist. And I read this week from Pastor Brian Zahnd, who has written a fair bit on the book of Revelation, but I thought this was clever. Or not clever, but clear in how he summarizes this cryptic book. He says, Revelation is a wild and creative portrayal of the conflict between the beastly empire of Rome and the peaceable reign of the Lamb of God. What it foretells is the eventual triumph of the kingdom of Christ. It does this in a genre of macabre comedy. Hideous monsters finally conquered by a little lamb, a slaughtered lamb who lives again. This is how John the Revelator tells of the triumph of Jesus over the Roman Empire and all beastly empires to come. And so this is the story of Revelation that is being told. Essentially, how does the Lamb win? What does it look like for victory through the lens of the Lamb? And he is telling this story kind of over and over again. We've said this sort of like 3 consecutive concentric circles with ever increasing reach. And then this is the third one we're in now, the final one, and how the Lamb overcomes evil itself. And so the central point of Revelation is to reveal to us the way of the Lamb and how the rejection of the way of the Lamb will inevitably lead us to all sorts of destruction and chaos and ultimately hell here on earth. And Zahn says that Jesus' lamb-like kingdom brings a saving alternative to the beast-like empires of our world. And this is the lens that I am insisting we absolutely must read the book of Revelation through. And the reason, and some of this has been evident in this week in international news, but the reason is because bad theology kills. Bad theology kills. It has consequences. It's not just something we theorize about in the safe confines of a church. Our ideologies are formed here, and they have implications to how we live out in the world. And that is certainly true. When Revelation is misread, say as a futuristic prophecy that's fulfilled in a particular figurehead or some event in history or whatever, and we read Revelation as pointed, it has to mean this. Well, bad things have tended to happen when we've done that. Right? And history has shown this over and over again. I read a post from Shane Claiborne this week. This is funny because I'm lenting from social media, so that's how good this is going. But this is what Shane Claiborne wrote. He said, "Bad theology gets people killed. If your theology justifies the killing of thousands of people in order to expedite the apocalypse and quicken the second coming of Christ, let it go. God is not a monster. God is not a blood-hungry villain. God is love. God is with the widows and orphans and the mums in Iran holding their babies. God stands with the vulnerable, the meek, the merciful. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. He blesses the peacemakers, not the war makers. He carries a cross, not a gun. He loved his enemies so much he was willing to die for them. Choose love. Love always wins." Amen? And so bad theology has consequences. And so this is why we are tackling the book of Revelation the way that we are tackling it. And we'll leave it at that for now. This morning, we want to pick up where we left off last week. If you will recall, last week we began to speak of the nature of evil, who's personified in this dragon in Revelation 12. And this dragon is a bit of a loser. Right? He tries to snatch the baby that we see is revealed as Jesus, and he fails at that. And then he has this battle in heaven against Michael and his angels, and he fails at that. And then he's cast down to earth where he goes after the woman. And guess what? He fails at that as well. So the chapter ends with him turning to the children of the woman, the other children of the woman. And this is what it says at the end of chapter 12. The dragon was enraged at the woman, went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. And so depending on the version of the translation that you read, some end chapter 12 with this and some begin chapter 13. But either way, the dragon is standing now on the shore, and he calls out two beasts. And this is where we'll pick it up this morning. Two beasts in chapter 13. One beast is from the land, from the sea, and another beast is from the land. And I want to read just the first little bit of chapter 13, and then I'm not going to read it all because it's just a lot, but I will read just a few verses. "I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his powers and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshiped the beast and asked, 'Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?'" So taken together with the dragon, we see that the sea beast, and what we'll read about again about in a minute, the land beast, has been sort of famously dubbed a trinity of evil by the Revelation scholar Eugene Boring. He's got a very unexciting last name. You don't have to laugh at that. That was a pity laugh, I know. But I think that this is a very apt description of this beast character and together take the dragon and then these two beasts, these three things. They're everything that the Holy Trinity that we believe in our Christian theology is not. So in the holiness of the Trinity, this is the evil incarnateness of the dragon and the two beasts. And so that's a helpful way of looking at it. But quite simply, the sea beast represents kings and empires and powers. And I think it's in chapter 16 or 17 of this Revelation, John will go on to describe some more details about this sea beast, and he will essentially provide enough details that it is without question referencing, at least for John and his audience, the Roman Empire itself. And if you think about from where Asia Minor is, where John is writing this, where his audience is reading this, it would be across the sea that Rome would be, across the sea. And so, you can kind of imagine this giant sea beast coming out of the, over the horizon or something. And you can kind of see, it probably is pointing to the Roman Empire. And so, again, it's got 7 heads and it's got 10 crowns. And how do you fit 10 crowns on 7 heads? Well, you don't. But that's the point. It's a symbol. It's not meant to be literally taken, right? It's pointing to something else. And ultimately, it's pointing to powers and authorities, and evil powers and authorities, which again is the inverse of the Lamb's power and authority. And if you're wondering, where do the specifics about the leopard and the feet of the bear and a mouth of a lion come from? Well, it's not really any surprise, because by now we've seen this pattern happen over and over again. John gets that from, anyone? The Old Testament, and specifically Daniel, and specifically what chapter? Oh, see, that's the one. Daniel chapter 7. And so we have seen again and again and again that John uses imagery from the Hebrew scriptures to help with his audience understanding this, right? And so this is another picture. It's not an exact, he's not lifting it, but he is borrowing from that imagery. And so you don't have to get too excited about, oh man, this must mean that or that. No, it's just Old Testament imagery. It's cool. Now, we're going to skip a bunch of this, but I want to just read verse 7. It says, the sea beast was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. And so the mission of the sea beast is basically to wage war, to terrify the church, to conquer them. Let's hold that for now as we turn our attention to the land beast. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. So this beast, well, first of all, it only has 2 horns, so it is less powerful. But those horns are like a lamb. And that's very intentional that John is saying that. In other words, this beast presents as a fake lamb. And again, we'll read in, I think it's chapter 16 or 17, this beast is described as a false prophet, right? So a prophet is someone who speaks on behalf of God, whatever the words of God are to the people. This is a false prophet. And so this is presenting as a fake lamb, what Eugene Peterson calls a clumsy counterfeit of the magnificent true lamb. And his mission is he makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast. And so it does this. How does it do this? Through signs and wonders. Really sort of oohing and awing the crowd. But notice the way it does this, its MO, is through deception. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. So again, pretending to be the lamb, deceiving the whole earth. So 2 beasts here are from the dragon, right? One from the sea, one from the land, and they are doing sort of the dastardly bidding of this dragon to use fear and to conquer the church. and to deceive into false worship. If we were to put this very succinctly, we would say fear distorts obedience, deception distorts worship. This is what Eugene Peterson says. Since it is not against creatures that this dragon will mount his assault, but against creatures of Christ, the dragon requires a stratagem that will deflect their obedience and falsify their witness. He will frighten them into disobedience. He will deceive them into illusion. So fear and deception. These are two tried and true tactics of the enemy that have been working on the church quite effectively, I might say, for the past 2,000 years. And I mentioned last week that the power of fear and how it might just be the most effective tool in the devil's tool bag. If you look around, we see how it has become sort of the driving force behind so much of how society itself functions. Right? Fear underscores our politics. Right? We're afraid that if those guys get into power, all of society is going to collapse, or the world's going to go to hell in a handbasket. We can't have that. So it drives our politics. Fear underscores our economy. Right? If we think about fear in that way, there is this mentality of scarcity that so many live out of. We need to have more in order to make it. Or there is a fear that we won't be accepted by our peers or friends or whatever, and so we have to have like the best gadgets and the best tools and biggest house, and we buy things motivated by fear in all sorts of different ways. Do you see that? And fear underscores our media. Our digital media, you think about it, we talked about this in the past, the algorithms understand how effective fear works in getting clicks and getting eyes on ads and contents like that. So it feeds us content that is driven by fear. And our news media does the same thing. These are some headlines. Dishwasher causes kitchen fire in Kansas. Firefighters warn against running your appliances overnight. You better not run your dishwasher at night because it might happen to you. But do you see that? These are common headlines. This is the common tactic that our world operates out of. Or this one, can eating leftover rice make you severely ill? Here's what to know. Be careful. And then we tune into the 6 o'clock news because we got to watch that to make sure that I don't eat rice that might make me really, really sick. But do you see how fear is, it's just everywhere. Everywhere you turn in our world, fear happens to be there. And yes, it is absolutely 100% a societal thing, but weirdly, and I would say ironically, at least it seems to me, fear is especially pronounced in the church. Do you see that? Why do I say ironically? Because of all people, Christians are called to not live out of fear. Perfect love casts out fear. And yet it seems like fear drives our agendas, or as much or even more so than the rest of the world. We're afraid of everything, of government overreach. I remember during the pandemic, this was such a big deal to people in the church. You're not going to let us worship God. God will be so annoyed with that. He will be so angry. If we can't worship, then that's the government trying to take away our freedom of religion, our ability to worship together, and we are afraid, right? We're afraid of cultural agendas that are here to undermine the values of the church, right? Whatever the world is going to do, it's here. It's trying to attack the church, and so we're on the defensive all the time. I remember when I was a kid, creation science was like the big thing because evolution was being taught in our schools, and I know it still is, and whatever. Evolution is taught in our schools, and it's like, oh my goodness, why? Why is evolution being taught in our schools? Well, it's clear it's trying to undermine the Christian agenda, right? You can't have that. And so all these resistance efforts to the efforts of our society to choke out the church are emerged, but they all are birthed out of fear. For a people who are to be abiding in the steadfast faithfulness of the Lord, we sure have a tendency to exchange peace for anxiety, don't we? And this is a problem because as a people who operate out of fear, the first casualty is obedience. Peterson notes the sea beast's primary tactic is to frighten us into disobedience, specifically disobedience to the nonviolent, self-sacrificing way of the Lamb. Hear this, when we operate out of an impulse of fear, we cannot respond with courage in the face of the enemy. We cannot respond with love as a form of resistance. Instead, we buckle and we compromise and we fail to live out of the hope that we profess to have in the Jesus who has promised to restore all things. Remember last week we looked at, I think it was chapter 12, how Michael and his angels defeated the dragons. And it wasn't through violence, it was through courage. It said they did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death, which is how John counsels the church to respond to the sea beast. Listen again to Peterson. I've referred to him a lot here, but he's got a lot of good stuff to say. After presenting the sea beast and his violence, St. John counsels, here's a call for the endurance and faith of the saints, Revelation 13:10. There is no question but that we may lose our lives by violence in this world, but death is not defeat. Death is not the worst thing that can be done to us. And then he adds, this is difficult counsel to follow. Are you sure that the way to address fear is to recognize that we might die, but don't worry, death isn't the worst thing? Thanks for that confidence booster. Right? But it's not simply, stop being afraid, because fear itself is not something that we have to shirk altogether. Fear is built into our DNA. It's how we've survived as long as we've survived. We literally have a fight or flight impulse in our physiology that has caused us to live for millions of years, or 6,000 years, depending on where you're at. But it caused us to live for millions of years as a species, or thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years as a Homo sapiens species. We needed that. So fear itself is not the problem. It's letting fear be used as a weapon by the beast, by evil itself, when it becomes a problem. Does that make sense? The beast doesn't actually have to kill us in order to have victory. He just needs us to disobey the way of the Lamb, right? We don't need to be that dramatic and say, it's, death or bust. No, it is, death could happen, but ultimately all the evil cares about is that for us to kind of get off course and to disobey Jesus. And disobey the way of Jesus, to stop following the way of the Lamb. Because the real defeat isn't death. Hear me say that. The real defeat isn't death. The real defeat is disobedience. It's allowing fear to turn us into a people who forsake love, right? Or who neglect to forgive, who are resistant and choose not to love our neighbor, not to love our enemy. Who choose not to tell the truth because it costs us something, and we're afraid of the cost. All of those ways that you and me, have been complicit in compromising truth and compromising the way of the Lamb in order to secure comforts or security or reputation. All of those things are what the devil, what Satan, what evil is trying to get out of us. And like I said, it's been pretty effective. And so fear is normal, but letting fear lead is optional. And that's what John is warning us against. Don't let fear dictate your every move, especially your obedience in light of the Lamb. And this is why the counsel for handling the sea beast ends with this. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Because when fear rises in us, when the temperature gets turned up, when we feel that inner impulse to strike first, to withdraw, to harden our hearts, to demonize our neighbor, we are instructed, do not allow fear to overcome us. Our victory, the church's victory, will not be found in safety or in hiding or in capitulating, but in faithfulness to the way of the Lamb. Amen? And then there's the second beast, which his tool is also fairly effective, and his tool is deception, right? And again, like this will be revealed later on in the book of Revelation as the false prophet, but the whole sort of emphasis of the second beast is in regard to sort of our religion. And its whole job is to get people worshiping the dragon. And it uses churchy language and spiritual vibes and all that good stuff, but it doesn't use truth. It comes with two horns like a lamb, which is John's way of saying it looks safe, it's familiar, it looks like something you would trust inherently, implicitly. But when it opens its mouth, he says it's the dragon talking. Religion has this uncanny ability to convince us through the trappings of the miraculous, through confident leaders who just tell us the way it is, through those who within our own communities who are using all the right spiritual language, who know how to play on our emotions, who can impress us with our certainties about God, with our perfect black and white theology, about all the ways that the world works, that God works, how the Bible works. And trust me, you know this. It can be so compelling, right? We're all drawn to that. Because it makes sense. It makes life way easier. That is a religion that we would all much rather get behind. Something that just exists in the theoretical. But this is what James tells us is good religion. This is what he says. Pure religion. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Jesus says the same thing. His followers are known for being those who clothe the naked and feed the hungry and visit prisoners. Anything else is ultimately smoke and mirrors. And I confess, it has been embarrassingly way too long for me to grab a hold of that truth, because I would much rather cling to the theoretical stuff about God, all of that lovely theology. And I'm not saying none of that is important. Of course it is. But when we get hung up on those things, or in the case of John here, and as he describes the second beast, the signs and wonders that are performed, when we esteem traditions and rituals over our actions and our love, whatever trick this land beast uses and waves in front of us in order to neglect caring for the vulnerable and loving our enemies and giving ourselves sacrificially in all of these ways that James would say is faultless religion. When we do that, that is all smoke and mirrors. So how do we protect ourselves from being deceived religiously? This is what John says in verse 18. This calls for wisdom. Not vibes, not hype, not conspiratorial thinking about, it says, let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, its number of man. That number is 666. John is not saying you need wisdom in order to understand what this number represents. Let's talk about this number for a second. Whether you've been raised in the church or not, 666 has something to do with the end times and all of this. And it's typically used to refer to the Antichrist. And people throughout history have used all sorts of complicated, cryptic ways of decoding what this 666 means. And they have come up with, Bill Clinton and the Pope, all sorts of characters throughout history. Barney the dinosaur was the most recent that I heard. I remember learning this in college. I'm pretty sure this was a joke, but here, let me explain to you how this is done. How you can receive 666, the Antichrist, is Barney. How you can arrive at Barney the dinosaur being the Antichrist. The argument went like this. You take the phrase, cute purple dinosaur. So it's not specifically Barney, but it's cute purple dinosaur. Of course, it has to refer to this. You change the U's to V's because Latin. Then you remove the letters that are Roman numerals. You convert what's left into numbers, and then you subtract them in some clever way, and guess what number you're left with? That's right, 666. Therefore, Barney the dinosaur must be the Antichrist. So maybe it's that, but I have my doubts, right? I don't think John really cared too much about the cryptic ways we would decipher what 666 means. In fact, most serious scholars who are scholars of Revelation and that, they point to Emperor Nero as being the representative of 666. And it's not even that complicated. They use a form, an ancient practice of assigning numerical values to letters. It's called gematria. Don't ask me what this is, but it makes good historical sense. There's fairly widespread consensus that is who John was referring to. Nero, if you look through your history books, was this crazy, he was a nut job, but anyway, and he represents evil. Very much so. He represents Antichrist, everything that is not Christ. And so 666 is the number of a man. And so what is the wisdom that John is asking us to have here? It's not do this complicated math to get at some figure. No, it's to understand this number of man. He's saying, don't be dazzled and impressed by the ways of man. Things that look like God, but are ultimately man. Don't be deceived by that. Use wisdom. Don't be deceived by religious performances that are void of the presence of God. Yeah? Don't mistake spectacle for the Lamb. And that's why he's calling us to wisdom. John is not inviting the church into date setting or code cracking or pointing to some world leader as the Antichrist. He's inviting the church to discern, to see through all of the smoke and mirrors, all of the counterfeit power, to recognize when something looks lamb-like but speaks with the voice of the dragon. And my tendency is like, I look around the church today and I can point to all the very obvious things, the Joel Osteens, I'm just going to call it out, or the prosperity gospel, or, all those weirdo charismatic televangelists that are out there. And they say that is who is Antichrist, and that is clear. And I think there's truth to that. I think a lot of that stuff is Antichrist. But what about religion that actually looks like the Lamb, as John talks about here, that offers up the right words about peacemaking, that speaks about selfless, others-oriented love, and yet flat out neglects the vulnerable, the widows, the orphans, those that James talked about as pure and faultless religion? What about religion that is able to wax poetic about bringing God's will here to on earth as it is in heaven, and yet when pressed will protect comfort over compassion, right? Will protect image over integrity, will work at self-preservation and ensuring that the institution of the church survives over the well-being and flourishing of the most vulnerable? What about those kinds of churches? And you don't have to look very far out there to see that. What do we do with a faith that knows all the right words about peace and love, but keeps the vulnerable at arm's length when love becomes too costly? Is that not also smoke and mirrors? Is that not also deception? Because it's entirely possible to speak lamb language while living beastly lives. Yeah? And if we're honest, I think all of us are prone to this. I know I am. As dissidents of the empire, we are called to expose those pretensions that have nothing to do with what James calls pure and faultless religion. Why? Because any religious or form of worship that makes a show, that puffs up, that causes us to take our eyes off of the vulnerable, the poor, the suffering, whether it is out there with some whack job preacher bragging about a new private jet that God has, gifted him, or it is in here with grappling with our own traditions and rituals and our theology and all of the things that seem so stinking important to us, whatever that stuff is that is distracting us from caring and loving the most vulnerable, the ones that Jesus came for, from living the sacrificial way that Jesus demonstrates to us, all of those things become smoke and mirrors. And so the thing we are to have wisdom in discerning here is to pay attention to the number of man, all the ways we are prone to detract from the holy, reconciling work of God in this world. We are called to have wisdom to discern and call it out as we see it, to repent of the antichrist worship, and to draw our allegiance back to the Lamb who sits on the throne. Amen? Cool. So like I said, in the chapters that are coming, we are going to get a clear picture of these two beasts. The sea beast is Rome, and the land beast is, like I said, the false prophet. But regardless of what or who they represent for John, this is a passage that remains incredibly relevant for you and I today, you and me today. Right? And it leads us to ask whether we can recognize these tactics in our own world, in our own lives, in our own church. Because fear is still really effective at bending our obedience. And deception is still really easy to fall into in directing our worship elsewhere. But the call of you, and the call of me as the church is the same that it has always been. John tells us, practice patient endurance and faithfulness. Use wisdom in discerning your worship. Keep your eyes on the Lamb. Keep caring for the vulnerable. Keep telling the truth through your life. How you live, how you represent Jesus in the world. And this, friends, is how the dragon, how evil will be overcome. How it is being overcome in our lives.